Is an FA-18 electrical systems technician with BMFA 232. He's a recent graduate of San Diego State University with a bachelor's degree in history. He's currently pursuing his master's degree at SDU with interests in naval aviation, the Vietnam War, and the Cold War. One of the things that people don't realize is when you're taking your guests around on a tour, there's a lot of artwork involved, and this is one of the prime examples of how they use art in aviation. Jerry, would you be with me?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'll try to make this short. I know you guys have things to do, but first and foremost, I'd like to go ahead and thank each and every one of you for the time and effort you put into the museum. I know that for me, growing up, I didn't go to this specific Air and Space Museum. I grew up on the East Coast, but going to aviation museums was really an important part of my childhood. So I want to go ahead and thank you for all the time and effort you put in. So I'm going to talk about Squadron Insignia. I know on the flyer it said aviation Squadron Insignia. I decided to limit it to Marine Corps just because I could be here all day if I was just talking about it from all eras. And I'm going to be focusing more on World War II specifically during this talk, just because that's when it seems like there was really this leap in popularity of using Squadron Insignia. So, just talking about my interest in Squadron Insignia, first of all, I think that they look cool. Second of all, oh, sorry about that. So, second of all, as it was mentioned, the introduction, I was with BMFA 232, and very quickly, I noticed within the first week that I was in Miramar that our Squadron Insignia was different than many of the other ones. Many of the other ones have more of this sort of round Squadron Insignia, and ours is very distinct as it's in a diamond shape. And so I kind of noticed that was a little different, and so I always kind of wondered, why is that? And then the other thing that kind of sparked my interest in Squadron Insignia was when I was in Iwakuni in 2013, 2014 on UDP. We overlapped with VMAQ2, who at the time was flying Prowlers. And so at the time they were known as the Death Jesters. But then I also saw this other patch that they would wear on Fridays and occasionally. And so I looked into it and I thought, well, why does it say censored? And then I found out that they used to be called the Playboys. And then after the tailhook scandal in the 90s, it wasn't cool to use that name anymore, so they ended up having to change it. But they still have this patch, kind of as a reference to their heritage, kind of sticking it, to the system for making it change their name. But it's kind of interesting, and so that kind of got my interest in Squadron Insignia. So today I'd like to kind of talk about the definition of Squadron Insignia as far as what I'm going to be referring to during this talk, because there are different definitions, I guess. Kind of wanted to talk about the background of the tradition of using Squadron Insignia, where it came from and how it developed. I wanted to talk about the increasing popularity. Started kind of gaining popularity, after World War I, but really it started taking off after World War II. I want to talk about the elements of Squadron Insignia. When I looked at the sample of insignia from World War II, just kind of what I noticed, what messages they were conveying, what elements were common in a lot of them, and then finally I want to kind of talk about why insignia matters, or why I think it matters. So the first thing is, as far as the definition, I'm going to be specifically referring to the distinguishing symbol or figure for a squadron that it chooses to adopt. So, as many of us know, a squadron, it's given its mission. It may be a fighter squadron, a bombing squadron, an attack squadron. They can't change that. That's something that comes from headquarters. They can't change the number of the squadron, whether they're 224, 514, whatever. They can't change that. Even the the designation on the tail, you know, if it's Delta Tango or Whiskey Foxtrot, they can't change that. What they do have control over is their squadron insignia, that mascot, you know, and sometimes it changes many times over the years. Other times it remains pretty much the same. And then it's also what represents the squadron on its patches, on its aircraft. You'll see it on official correspondence, you know, on the header of orders, you name it, that's kind of where you see it as well. So the origins as far as squadron insignia, really, I mean, this is kind of going back to this tradition from the Middle Ages, right? So, you know, you have knights, they're in armor, you can't tell who's who, and so they would wear some kind of seal on their armor so that, you know, everyone knew who was a friend and who was an enemy. You know, then it kind of continues on. You know, you see during the Revolutionary War, you know, the uniforms, you know who the redcoats are, you know that they're the British. During the Civil War, you know, the blue uniforms, the gray uniform. So it's not exactly the insignia, but you want to be able to understand who is a friend and who's an enemy. During World War I, there was kind of this resurgence of this idea as far as the pilot being like a knight in the sky, you know, the act of flying and air combat, it was seen as, you know, chivalrous, and, you know, and there was kind of this mental connection between knights and pilots. And so there was you know, Germans were doing it, the British were doing it, but as far as the Americans go, I'm probably going to butcher this, the Lafayette Escadrille. Yes, thank you. They adopted an Indian head insignia by 1916, and they were the first, you know, because they were an all-American unit by that time, they were the first American unit to adopt that. Now you have other units that adopted insignia as well, like Eddie Rickenbacker's Hat and Ring Squadron. You know, there were other units that adopted some kind of insignia. But as far as the Marine Corps goes, they didn't really put it on aircraft so much. They would wear a shoulder insignia, and it would look like this, and this was kind of the aviation insignia used for a long time. But aircraft would only have that aviation-specific eagle, globe, and anchor. And then, you know, after World War I, you know, in the mid-1920s, you see squadron insignia starting to appear. The first Air Squadron, they had the Ace of Spades card, you could see that on their tail. And then VF-3M, the predecessor to VMFA 232, they had a flying red devil inside of the diamond. And so between the mid-1920s and 1939, there were only 5 more squadrons that really adopted some kind of squadron insignia in the Marine Corps. So this is kind of going off on a bit of a tangent, but you'll kind of see where it kind of comes back in a little bit. I also thought it was really interesting that Disney contributed a lot as far as squadron insignia goes. So their first insignia for the military was requested in June of 1939, and it was requested by Navy Reserve pilot Burt Stanley of the Fighting 7 Air Squadron, and they were aboard the USS Wasp here in San Diego. So he reached out to Disney Studios and actually requested that they draw this insignia for their squadron, and they did so. And as more squadrons, and it wasn't just squadrons, it was bases, it was, you know, ground units, I mean every unit in the military across all branches seemed to want to have an insignia created by Disney Studios. They were getting so many requests that they actually hired five artists who that was their full-time task. That's all they did. They came to work and they were designing squadron insignia. And so they got so many that I think the head of this group, he was quoted saying that there were always 300 designs behind. You know, they were just getting so many requests. And it got to the point where he was saying, you know what, we would prefer using minor characters rather than the major characters, the big names like Mickey, Donald Duck, Goofy, because there's only so many variations and you want to make sure that your unit is unique. And when they did this, they gave the squadrons the exclusive and perpetual right and license to reproduce and use the following motif, device, or design. And generally, they basically did it for free, but I think in the contract, just to make it business-like, they said it was $1, but considering you're getting artwork straight from Disney, $1 is nothing. So, you know, I was talking to my fiance over here yesterday, and I was kind of running through this presentation. I thought she fell asleep by this point, but then she was asking questions about it. So I was, you know, she asked, well, why would they do that? And so there are a couple things. By that time, when Germany started attacking Poland and other countries in Europe, they kind of, the government kind of cut them off and said, you can't be doing business over there, so they kind of sought business elsewhere. Some of the stuff that they were doing was they were making instructional videos for, you know, and training videos. You know, Lockheed had a film on 4 ways to rivet. And, you know, so they were doing things like that. They were trying to expand into South America. They saw that as potential. And so they were trying all of these different things to kind of keep themselves busy. And I think that's kind of where they said, okay, you know what, that we can go ahead and make Squadron Insignia for the squadrons. There's also the element of patriotism, where, you know, everyone was contributing to the war effort, and this is one way that you know, Disney Studios could go ahead and contribute. And then I would also speculate that maybe they were thinking, well, if we go ahead and we have this connection between you know, the troops and, you know, our company and everything, that's definitely brand loyalty if there wasn't already some brand loyalty. And so you know, troops would remember Disney was there, they were supporting us, they were providing insignia for us during the war. So I think that it was kind of a mutual relationship, you know, between the two. So as far as what could be in the insignia, this is what was supposed to be in the insignia. There's from the Chief of Naval Operations, there's an Aviation Circular letter number 46-44, and they basically said that they can privately employ, or they can employ private artists and commercial artists. That's okay, but if you're going to use any of their artwork, you cannot use copyrighted material held by the artist. They didn't want to get into any kind of lawsuits or anything later on. So that's why when you saw what Disney offered, they said, you know, you can use this as long as you're not making money off of it. Just go ahead and use it for you know, for the squadron purposes. The design must be in keeping with the dignity of the service. There were plenty of designs that were rejected for that purpose. So she, of course,
Hard to believe.
so it should have some kind of originality, and the significance should be related to the mission. And I'll get into this a little bit later. Some of them I didn't really feel like there was much of a connection to what their mission was, or if there was, it was something that maybe was discussed but wasn't apparent by looking at the insignia. Also, one of the rules that they adopted was you could have no red in your insignia, which makes sense if you're flying, especially in the Pacific against the Japanese. You know, part of the thing is you want to be able to identify who's your friend and, you know, who's your enemy, and, you know, you don't want to have any red on there. So the sample that I looked at, I was focusing on aviation squadron insignia from 41 to 46, and I was also looking at the flying unit. So I didn't really focus so much on the maintenance squadrons or the bases so much. I really focused more on which squadrons had aircraft and were flying them. So from what I looked at, there were 144 squadrons total, but there were 30 that had no information whatsoever. They didn't have a name, they didn't have any artwork that's survived or that was visible or available at that time. And so maybe I'll find those later on because I intend to continue doing research with this, but 30 of them, there's no information whatsoever, so I didn't really focus on them so much. So the 114 that I looked at, when I'm talking about the different, the different elements that you would find in the insignia later on, we're really only talking about 114, and that includes transitions, if they went from a torpedo squadron to a fighter squadron, so on and so forth. I included all of that. So the most popular element that I saw was that the insignia featured something about flight, whether it was flight gear, whether it was the fact that they are flying in the insignia, which I would think would be a no-brainer, considering it's an aviation unit. But surprisingly, not every squadron had something that conveyed that they were in flight. So if you look at VMSB 233, the flying deadheads, the skull has the flight cap on. In addition to the crosshairs and the bomb and things like that, but it conveys a sense of its purpose is to go fly. And then VMB 423, the seahorses, you see what looks like a cloud, and everything kind of shows that they belong up in the sky. So out of these 114 that I looked at, 78%, which was an overwhelming majority, but still a little bit less than what I had expected. The next most common element that I noticed was that they tended to feature animals. If you look at VMSB 343, that squadron is known as the gorillas. There's a name.
Common?
No, I can't. I'm drawing a blank. I feel like it maybe had something to do with the CO's name. I'm drawing a blank. I forgot to put the label there. But then you've got VMF 314, today known as the Black Knights. But by that time, they were using this Disney insignia, and they were known as Bob's Cats. So 65% of the insignia that you would see had animals in some way, shape, or form. The next element was that the insignia clearly conveyed the mission of that squadron. So if you look at what that Chief of Naval Operations letter said, it said that the insignia was supposed to convey the mission of the squadron. Well, there were a lot of insignia that were used in theater, but weren't actually formally approved by the Chief of Naval Operations. And as a result, 59% of them did convey, some sense of mission. Like VMB 614 and VMSB 244, the bombing Banshees. They each show a bomb being dropped. It shows that's kind of what they're supposed to be doing. Then,
VMB 614, were they at night? They operate at night?
off the top of my head, I don't know. I know that the fighter squadrons, they would have an N after the B in parentheses. I don't know if they did that with the bombers though. So I'm not 100% sure off the top of my head. Then, I think another obvious thing is, the squadron wants to convey a sense of strength, right? They want to show that they're the baddest guys out there, because you don't want to, go out there looking all soft. And so you've got VMF 213, the Hellhawks. You've got the Hawks swooping in, and then VMB 612, shows, that they're not messing around. They've got the machine gun, they've got the bomb, and, they mean business.
That's a lot of red.
Yeah.
It is. Now,
But the Aviation Circular came out in '44, so this was before that.
yes. And sometimes they would wear it on maybe a flight suit. They would do that, and then they would modify it later on. So they would replace the red temporarily. Now, another thing that was kind of interesting. Sometimes for security reasons, they wouldn't put the number of the squadron on here. So this is a good example of VMB 612. The way they would get around that is, if you look at the bullets here, they've got a group of 6. They've got 1, and then they've got 2. So you kind of put it together. Sometimes you would see it with stars as well, although I didn't really see how they did that with the Hellhawks, because I see 2 here, I see 1 here, and that's way more than 3. So I don't know what they were doing there. Another part of the insignia that I noticed was that a lot of them tend to feature guns or other munitions. There's only 42% of them that would show that. At the same time, though, not everyone was armed. Sometimes you had reconnaissance aircraft and things like that. But if you look at VMSB 133, that bulldog obviously means business, and so does this Black Panther. Showing that they have a bomb, and that's what they do. And then as far as the Marine Corps aviation insignia that I looked at, about 28% of them that had insignia, at some point in time, they used one created by Disney. I thought it was kind of interesting because I would think today, if you got something made by Disney Studios, you would treasure it and continue to use it. But there were a lot of squadrons that they had something that was made by Disney, and then they said, we're going to use something else. So 28% of them were made by Disney at some point in the squadron's history during this point in the war, or over the course of the war. And then 72%, sometimes it would just be it would be a local artist, within the squadron. Sometimes they would use other cartoons. I'll get to that in a minute. But these are examples of Disney insignia, or Disney created insignia. So you have VMF 321. That's not a well-known Disney character. You can tell it's that style of animation, but it's not a well-known name. And you see that, kind of.
What is it?
I'm sorry?
What character is it?
I'm not sure. It didn't list a specific character. It may have just been a Disney-style cat. It may have been kind of a cat in the background, and you see it for 3 seconds in a film. So they don't really mention that anywhere that I've read. But you can see that they show what the squadron does. They've got the headset there. They're communicating. They've got the rockets. They've got the bombs. They're looking for a fight. Now, VMTV 622. This is an example of squadron insignia that uses a well-known name. They use Donald Duck. And interestingly enough, as far as big name Disney characters, Donald Duck was overwhelmingly the most popular big name character that was used. And if you think about it, it makes sense because he's usually pretty angry. He has quite a temper, and he's not the character you want to mess around with. You're not so worried about getting Mickey mad, and that's part of the reason why Disney didn't really use Mickey Mouse as an insignia.
One thing to remember when you were talking about some of the squadrons having Disney and saying, no, we'll use something else. Disney was not very popular prior to World War II.
Really?
They were struggling. And the only way they really kept alive is by having contracts with the government in terms of making those films. Disney didn't want to have to do that. They had no choice.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's good to know. Thank you. So, yeah, so this is an example of a Disney character, that, you know, a big name Disney character that was used. Now, aside from Disney, there were other studios that made that made Squadron Insignia as well. So this one for VMF 217, Max's Wild Hares, this was actually an officially licensed Warner Brothers insignia, and that's clearly Bugs Bunny or Bugs Bunny's cousin, you know, and so that's an example of official use, and this was, you know, a very small percentage of what I saw, but also another thing I saw was there were imitations, you know, either of Warner Brothers or of Disney. There were a couple of you know, Mickey Mouse lookalikes, you know, but not necessarily officially created by Disney. And then this, I mean, I think that we can all agree it looks very, very similar to Bugs Bunny, and that would probably be grounds for you know, copyright infringement. But I think that that's not the main concern at the time. But there were plenty of imitations, you know, just because it was you know, a cartoon style that was seen a lot. And then about 25% of the insignia that I saw featured aircraft in some way. VMF 214, the Black Sheep, you know, they showed their Corsair. 323, the Death Rattlers, I think you guys have you know, one of their Corsairs here. They show off the Corsair on there. And interestingly enough, as I was researching this, I learned that I think it was this squadron in the 50s. They went to go replace it with the Crusader because they said, "Oh, we're not flying the Corsair anymore. That's old news." They had it for a couple of years, and then they went back to the Corsair because they wanted to preserve that history. Yes.
How many times do they frequently change the insignia?
It all depends on the squadron. I would say from what I've seen now, as far as these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of squadrons, like I didn't see. A lot of them were decommissioned after World War II and didn't come back. So there's only a few examples that I've really kind of been able to see how long it's lasted over 50, 60, 70 years. So sometimes there's very minor variations. The Death Rattlers are pretty consistent. 232, the Red Devils, they were fairly consistent as far as their insignia, but then there were other squadrons. Like I believe the checkerboards, they changed their insignia quite a bit. So I think it all depends on the squadron. Some squadrons are completely unrecognizable as far as their insignia and their name. Yeah, if you look back in World War II.
Well, like probably if they had their airplane on the insignia, would change the airplane if they moved to a different airplane.
Yes, and that's what some of the squadrons did, and then other squadrons they didn't do that so much. And like 323, they kind of wanted to preserve that history. You know, Black Sheep, they kind of made their name during World War II, and you know, they just kind of left it at that, or at least went back to that. And then you have VMF 514, and while you don't see a plane, you don't see wings, they're known as Whistling Death. And of course that was a nickname, or one of the nicknames for the Corsair, and that's what they were flying, so it makes sense. So in some way that's kind of representing their specific aircraft. Then, you know, of course you have supernatural elements, you know, whether it's a devil, you know, it's some kind of ghost, you know, what have you. You know, VMF and 531, the Gray Ghost, VMS 3, they didn't have an official name, but looks like some kind of devil, maybe kind of a Viking hat, something like that, but there's nothing about what their official name was. And that was about a quarter of the squadrons used something like that. And then in a similar vein, you've got superstitious elements. You know, sometimes you would have like you know, a clover. sometimes it's like some kind of poker reference. Here's another example of a squadron showing off their aircraft, VMF 441, the Blackjacks, and VMF 251, Lucifer's Messengers. So I kind of counted the devil in there as well, because that's, I think generally we would say that's bad luck, So,
guy.
I'd love for
and then I would say only 16% of Marine squadrons that had insignia showed off some kind of connection to the service. So, Twofold Hunt, Devil Dog, you can see it's a bulldog, the Marine Corps mascot. It's got the campaign cover on. They're very much showing that connection to the Marine Corps, as well as VMF 111. It's literally devil dog. So a lot of squadrons tended to do that as well, even if it's just the colors that they used. Only about 13% of the insignia that I looked at actually included a human figure in there, which I was kind of interested. I thought it was interesting that it was even that high, and even if it was just a human hand that you saw with a VMTV 234, a fist, holding an Avenger, or you've got the Fighting Corsairs, VMF 215. They show kind of both the human Corsair and the aircraft Corsair. So about 13% of the squadrons had some kind of human figure in there. And then of course they have some element of humor, 142 again, they're talking about, snafu, VMF 115, Joe's Jokers, and, just kind of I guess, some humor involved while also representing their squadron CO. That was only about 12% of the squadrons, though, that had obvious humor, but of course there could be something else, that maybe it wasn't conveyed as obviously through the insignia. Maybe it's more of an inside joke, but if you weren't there in the ready room, you wouldn't understand. And then I would say probably the least represented aspect of squadron insignia was featuring the location or a tie to some location. So VMSB 134, they included a cactus on there because cactus was a code name for Guadalcanal. So they included that in there to kind of show that. And then VMSB 333, one of their logos made by Disney, shows this bird dropping a bomb of sorts on a Japanese channel. So yeah, so that's only about 5.
Jeremy?
Yes.
That squadron insignia says 132 on it.
You're right. That's a typo. I apologize.
Plus cactus was a general term for the whole Air Force. They call it the Cactus Air Force.
Like
Included
Yeah.
Fighters, Marines, there was carrier planes that had
Army Air
landed there,
Force.
so all of Cactus Air Force was all over Guadalcanal.
Yes. Thank you. So finally, just to kind of wrap this up, why did I bother going through and looking at all these insignia, all the patches and things like that? Well, I think that insignia is important because it's a part of the squadron's history and its culture. Each insignia, it's decided upon by the members of the squadron. Sometimes it's just the officers, sometimes they open it up to even the maintainers. There's some kind of process where they come to a consensus, or sometimes don't. Sometimes someone just kind of puts an insignia out there, the CO kind of forces it down everyone's throat, and then you don't see that insignia lasting too long. And it conveys multiple messages. So it talks about who the squadron is, the way that they see this. Sometimes it's the way other people see them, because it has to get approved. Sometimes it features important figures in its history. You know, VMF 115, Joe's Jokers. You know, they were celebrating the legendary pilot Joe Foss. They talk about places that they've been. Sometimes you see Chinese dragons on there because the squadron was in China. You know, you see the cactus because they were in Guadalcanal. And then it also talks about significant events and challenges. You know, there's the Wake Island Avengers. You know, they had a challenge. They stood up and they overcame that challenge. And now that's been on their insignia for decades afterwards. They talk about the aircraft that they've flown and the way they're used, whether they're the bombers, you know, whether they're still showing off the fact that they flew the Corsairs. You know, sometimes they update it, as we were discussing earlier. Sometimes they update these insignia to reflect the new aircraft that they're flying. And it also reflects the way that they perceive themselves. As I was saying earlier, you know, you've got squadrons. They choose this tough mascot because they see themselves as a fierce opponent, you know, to whoever comes up against them. Other squadrons, you know, a lot of these observation squadrons, the VMOs, a lot of them used a cricket or grasshopper rather, because they weren't necessarily out to fight all the time, at least during this period, but they were hopping around. It showed kind of what they did, where they're going, their missions and things like that. So I think that insignia is important and sometimes overlooked for its importance. Sometimes people just get caught up in a neat looking design, but I think that it's important for showing the history and the story of that individual squadron. So thank you for listening. I appreciate it.
I've only got one comment.
Yes.
Did you do any correlation to the squadron call sign that they used airborne? You know, you have an insignia, and some of the insignias, like, you know, with the 333, sometimes you would see on their airplane just the rabbit. You know, you wouldn't see the whole patch, you know, kind of thing. But airborne, you know, like one squadron I was in, our call sign airborne was beep beep, okay? But we just used beep, airborne, or chargers. And in other words, what one word did they pick that kind of depicted who they were to that crowd that they were all flying with?
That's very interesting, and that's something I've kind of thought about. I didn't get a chance to look into that right now, but it was my understanding that those names were assigned just like the squadron number, you know, the tail designation, things like that. So that was my understanding, but maybe that wasn't always the case, and that's something I'd really like to.
Yeah, I think they're chosen about the squadron.
Okay, I'll go ahead and look into that. So.
And I didn't expect you necessarily to look at it, but it's just an interesting correlation to look at their patch, their logo, you know, insignia, and then what did they call themselves airborne?
Well, Jim, that goes too with the squadron designation that was on the aircraft, like Jerry Coleman's plane was Whiskey Sugar 8, and they probably use that for a call
It
sign.
does, but normally around the ship, we never use whiskey, sugar, or anything. We
Yeah.
just use B304, checking in.
Yeah, and there was,
They knew it was an A7, they knew what squadron it was,
yeah.
the whole bit.
And in the Vietnam era, I was a Sundowner. The squadron name was Sundowners, VF 111. Our call sign when we flew around the ship was directed to be Old Nick.
Yeah.
Old Nick was something that we called ourselves because they tested us on it. But in our reality, whenever we went on deployment, we called ourselves Sundowner as a radio call sign. The idea was it was optic a little bit to try and not be able to correlate a squadron to a mission by giving a strange
I
nick.
remember in the Med we had a fighter squadron called Gunfighters,
Yeah.
and you'd hear them
Well,
called
someday
Gunfighters.
every squadron had a call sign that they used.
But one of them was directed by OpNav. That's where Old Nick came from for the
So they may
Sundowners.
have been directed, but I'm just saying.
But we didn't use it.
Yeah, on the ship, they weren't used.
Yeah, we just called ourselves Sundowner
Yeah.
or
Because,
Eagles.
you know, because certainly, you know, we all had it on a tail, you know, you'd have November Lima,
Yeah,
304, So if you filed a flight plan, you filed as November, but, you know, even then, you would use your call sign.
Yeah, just, when I was a junior ensign, I was that rarity of fleet ensign. I never could quite figure out why we were calling ourselves Old Nick when we were doing training.
That's
And then when we got on deployment, we called ourselves Sundowner.
Yeah, see, we never had two names, we always had just one.
Yeah,
Old Nick was another name for the devil.
that's true.
Yes.
Two questions. One, did you do any correlation with nose art on an aircraft and the insignia that went with the squadron?
That is not something that, that I did. That's something I wanted to look into, but just for the, for simplicity, at this stage, I was just kind of looking at the insignia.
And
That's
the
just,
other-
that's
the
just
other-
master's thesis.
And the other question was, did you advance at all towards the astronauts and how did they go through the similar criteria for the astronaut patches? You know, the Mercury 7 guys and so on?
Yes, I've been interested in that as well, but I have not gotten quite there. I'm still trying to work my way through naval aviation and everything. I still need to look at the Navy squadron.
That's gonna take a while.
I know,
So who's your publisher?
I know that the astronaut patches, the astronauts themselves designed their patches.
Yeah.
So it wasn't designed by like a studio or anything like that.
Neil, NASA had veto power on that,
Yes,
didn't
yeah.
it? NASA had a veto power. on this.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course, you bet.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'd be happy to tell you what we're gonna have next month, except I don't know, but watch for the postings. I think, Jeremy, thank you, that was an excellent presentation. I had no idea what went into those symbols. I thought it was just chalk something up on the airplane and see what happened. But